The executive director of the BC Wildlife Federation is sounding the alarm over endangered species. Jesse Zeman, who just happens to live in the Okanagan Valley, says the pace at which the federal government is funding the cataloging of what species should be on the endangered list is going to take way too long.
Yeah, we're trying to make, I guess it's a twofold point. The first is, the report talks about the number of species that need to be assessed by CSIWIC, which is essentially a bunch of independent scientists who look at species and go, are these at risk? Are they at risk of extirpation? Could they become endangered? And so that report basically said it's going to take over 100 years for the government of Canada to go through this process to identify if these species are at risk. So that's the first part of the issue is we're talking like generations of people before we even know what is going on with a number of these species.
Okay, but could they not just focus on a shorter list and get through it a lot quicker?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And that's part of, I guess, what they'll do is they're saying we're going to reduce the amount of capacity. We aren't going to have enough people to do this process to identify these things. So they'll take species and kind of go through them every year. But quite frankly, if we have species at risk that we aren't going to review and figure out and do recovery plans for 100 years, they're going to be gone by then.
Yeah. Okay, so for people who are listening to this, what are we talking about here? Get people a picture in their heads. So what sort of species are we talking about?
Yeah, we have a number already that are species at risk and that have gone through the CSIWIC process. So endangered mountain caribou, southern mountain caribou, interior Fraser steelhead, so Thompson River steelhead, which was like this iconic species. There would be thousands of fish down to hundreds. They went through that process. And, the second part of the story is that the government of Canada rarely chooses to list these species under the Species at Risk Act. So the first part is you have these independent scientists who go, okay, are these things at risk of extirpation or being endangered? And then they're supposed to create recovery plans. And then it goes off to federal cabinet to say, hey, should we list these things under the Species at Risk Act? And if it's an animal that, essentially has a home range bigger than a bathtub, the government of Canada just says, no, we don't want to list them.
Whoa. So steelhead, caribou, both things that have wide ranges to their pattern of existence, difficult to manage. It goes off in so many directions that it's just hard to kind of clarify and move ahead on a firm plan.
Well, and I think, with Species at Risk Act, the reason why we don't use it is because it will impact industry. It will impact people. There are going to be threats identified. With caribou, the province has made some great strides around caribou recovery. But the reason why we don't use the Species at Risk Act is because it forces people and governments to adjust the way that they're using the landscape. And so, what's the point of having federal legislation for species at risk if we're not going to use it?
So if they were to properly assess what's happening with caribou and steelhead, what kinds of things would we have to do? What would we have to give up to give these species a chance?
Right. And so they, as part of the process, and the federal government will usually take it on, and sometimes they'll create their own recovery plans and they'll identify for caribou, one of the biggest drivers, and we've been told this for 50 years, is you got to stop logging in caribou habitat. That's one of the biggest things. And as we alter and reduce habitat available for caribou, there's things that happen like it increases moose populations, which can increase predator populations like wolves. So you end up managing wolves because you've gotten rid of habitat through logging. Right. So it's not straightforward. Nothing's simple in the world of biology and conservation, but there are solutions. There's no reason for us to say, well, we're just going to let interior Fraser steelhead disappear. There's no reason for that. And so we have federal legislation and we have processes like CSIWIC to go, okay, let's look at the landscape and figure out how many species are at risk. Let's identify what is driving them to be at risk, and then let's consider listing them. And so that whole process now is, we're 100 years out for some species.
And this is, if I can just sort of insert my uninformed bias here, listening to you say that this, at the rate it's funded now, could take 100 years. And I'm kind of thinking a lot of these things that they would be assessing through this process, well, that's just a lot of talk and it's a lot of measurement. I mean, I think there's a lot that people like you and others already know. Don't we need to be just acting on behalf of the steelhead and the caribou, parallel to, further solidifying who should be on what list or another?
Yeah. And what you're talking about is what we call managing to zero. And that's exactly what we're doing is we're talking, well, we should be doing stuff. And in the world of science, we constantly say this, and the BC Wildlife Federation will say, we need more science, we need to do this. But a lot of the world now is about adaptive science. So there's things that we know that we can do for steelhead right now. But there's things we know we can do for caribou right now, and a lot of times we choose not to do them because, oh, well, we got to go through the process. We have to go through the Kasiwik process.
Studying can be the excuse to not act.
Right. Yeah, that's it. And so that's what we call managing to zero is we're going to do a whole bunch of things that don't work and that don't change the outcome. And then when the outcome is these things go extinct or they become endangered, oh, well, now we have a problem. And so in the case of caribou, if we would have just taken care of them 40 or 50 years ago, we wouldn't be spending $10 million a year trying to recover them from the brink.
Right. But I guess, you need to get species like that on some kind of a list to really make serious change, to restrict industry where it wants to go. I mean, you're going to be up against a big wall there, and you need to have your ducks in a row, so to speak.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, sometimes there's things that are easier to do than others, but as it relates to the listing process, I mean, if we're going to go through this whole process with Kasiwik and it's going to go to federal cabinet and cabinet's just going to say, no, we're not going to list these species, I guess the question is, what's the point in any of it, right? If all we're going to do is talk about it, we had that with steelhead where it went through this long multi-year process, and we're talking like in one river, 20 fish is all that's left in the Chilcotin. And they decided not to list it, but they said, oh, hey, we have this great recovery plan and we're going to take care of these fish. The recovery plan did not move the needle at all. And like they opened up fisheries that should have been closed literally the day after. Like it's, so there's the part where we talk about stuff and there's the part where we do stuff. And in the world of conservation and science, we need to get on with doing stuff.
Right. So when Jesse Seaman writes a news release on behalf of the BC Wildlife Federation and puts it out, critiquing what we're doing on this, are they listening to you?
They do sometimes. Yeah, when it ends up in the press, they do. They ask a lot of questions.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, when we talk about no enforcement on the mid-Fraser and with the second lowest return of sockeye on record, which was this summer, usually, yeah, people start asking questions. They go, why don't we send out any officers on the mid-Fraser when there's no sockeye and there's sockeye being caught and kept on the mid-Fraser? Right. So a lot of it is about the public raising its voice. It's about the media doing its thing so that we can start talking about these issues, because if we don't, then we know what's going to happen.
Right. Well, thanks for this, Jesse. Really appreciate it. I know that the caribou and the steelhead can't speak for themselves.
Yep. Really appreciate your time.
We don't just report the news. We live here too. We're your neighbors, bringing you stories that matter to all of us. No government funding, no outside influence. Kelowna Now, local, independent. News you can trust.